Thank you to our partners at the Sandro De Meo Foundation for co-hosting this conversation. You can submit your questions throughout the event and we'll attempt to answer some of them at the end. To submit your question, go to the Slido and enter hashtag Aboriginal food, or you can use the link or QR code that is now on your screens. You can also subscribe to this Melbourne Knowledge Week's YouTube channel to stay up to date with Melbourne Conversation events. The City of Melbourne respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the unceded land, the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and pays respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. The City of Melbourne is committed to the reconciliation journey because at its heart, reconciliation is about strengthening relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people for the benefit of all Australians. I also want to pay my respects and personally would like to extend this acknowledgement to other Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, and First Nations people joining us today. For it is our elders and ancestors who hold the key to healing country and the world's broken food system for the health and well-being of our future ancestors and biosphere. For everyone else, wherever you're joining us from, you may even write in the comments whose land you're calling in from. We're pleased to have you here and hope that today's conversation helps unite in care for Australia's land, sky, and waters, and for each other. My name is Jen Ray. I'm your host for this Melbourne Conversation edition. I'm a two-spirit androgynous-looking person with salt and pepper short hair with a fair complexion and blue eyes. I will be taking my pink eyeglasses off and on throughout this conversation. I'm wearing a grey sweater and a striped scarf. I'm seated in a home office with a dresser behind me with some books and a gorgeous plant that my partner remembers to water. I'm an artist researcher of Canadian Métis Scottish descent from Treaty 6 territory on Turtle Island, otherwise known as Canada, currently living and working between Wurundjeri and Dja Dja Wurrung country. My practice is centered around cultural responses to the climate emergency and engage in discourses around disaster preparedness, food futures and food justice, and speculative futures. And these are predominantly articulated through multi-platform creative projects, writing, and collaborations. I'm the director of Fair Share Fair and the Faulkner Commons Project. So now on to food. Food is essential for our existence. Food is knowledge, it's labor, energy, technology, and food is medicine. Food brings us together, but also has the potential to divide us in times of scarcity. Increased food insecurity in Australia and worldwide is leading food producers and communities to rethink dominant, inequitable, and unsustainable industrialized agriculture and corporatized food systems. This conversation will explore how past and present Aboriginal food and agricultural practices might enable access to healthy and culturally appropriate food. Underpinned by principles of self-determination, our panel will ask how we can enable Aboriginal ideas and Aboriginal people to influence food system transformation. First up, we'll tune in to hear from Uncle Bruce Pascoe, best known for his work Dark Emu, Black Seeds, Agriculture or Accident, discussing old foods along with historical and contemporary Aboriginal agricultural practices, before delving into what I hope is some rich conversation with our panel guests, Tracy Hardy and Joshua Gilbert. We'll see you back here shortly.
Bruce Pascoe here, Yuin Bunurong, Tasmanian man. I'm on Yuin country here, on the banks of the Wallagrow River, on a farm called Yumbra Black Duck, and we're growing the foods here that old Aboriginal people used to grow. We've collected seed from the farm to introduce new plants into the old paddocks, because this was an old beef farm. And the reason that we're putting so much effort into growing our food, not just because we think it would be healthier for the planet and for people to be eating more vegetables, but also perennial plants, which are so much better for the earth than annuals. And with all the disturbance that you have to cause the earth to grow those annuals. But one of the other driving forces is, of course, political. because, as you might have noticed over the last few months, there are many people who still believe that Aboriginal people had no agency in the land, and that fact has been used against Aboriginal people politically, terra nullius just being one example of that, but it's still happening today. The dynamiting of the Jinmium cave is an indication that Australia just still doesn't get it, that not only are these places Aboriginal, but the stories they hold are important for Australia, all Australians. It's not just important for Aboriginal people, it's important for all Australians. And I remember when Justice Olney decided against the Yorta Yorta people all those years ago that their culture had been washed away by the tide of history, and so therefore they could get no native title. I'm no great fan of native title, actually, because I think it more often than not divides communities rather than brings communities together. It becomes a lawyer's picnic. But the Yorta Yorta firmly believed in it. They could see that they would be economically independent if they were able to do it. And the Gunai down here have done a terrific job with their successful native title claim. And there's a lot of employment there for Gunai people. So there are good things to come out of it. I just hate to see our own people fighting each other in the courts to decide who gets a slice of the pie. So by growing this food here, we are determined never to be in that situation where a High Court judge decides that we have lost contact with our culture, because we are very much in contact with our culture. In fact, at the weekend, three of us revisited a mountain that we'd been to the previous weekend but hadn't been able to scale because we were going there on the behest of one of the old people to see a representation of a very major food source for Aboriginal people. And he is interested in us maintaining contact with that food history. And it doesn't look like European farming in any way, nor should it, because this is Australia. This is not Kent in England. This is Australia. When you collect food in Australia, you do it the Aboriginal way that has been done for 100,000 years. You know, is it 65,000 years, 120,000 years? It doesn't matter. It's the longest period of time people have ever been in the one place. And we need to demonstrate that we haven't lost contact with those old ways, because what we're seeing with European farming techniques, they're not working in Australia. The reason that the Murray-Darling Basin is devoid of water is because we're growing the wrong plants, eating the wrong animals, and we need to learn that this country is different to others. She is older. Australia generally has poorer soil fertility than other countries, less water. You know, we're a very, very hard place to farm, and Aboriginal people had their methods to cope with that. And so our crops were perennial, and where Australia is devoting, you know, huge percentage of our water to growing cotton and creating a dust bowl as a result, our old people were concentrating on Mitchell grass, so-called Mitchell grass, because Major Mitchell saw it, so it's his name, not the old people's name. But that Mitchell grass was higher than his saddle. And it was there all the time. Perennial plant. The old people were seen to harvest it, seen to grind it into flour. And yet now we're growing a crop on that very same ground, which exposes the soil, created the dust storm of 2019 that made the Channel 7 news. And I'll never forget commentators throwing up their hands and said, oh, this country is so hard. Country's not hard. We're treating her hard. She's a soft land. She's a woman's land. She's Mother Earth. We just treat her really, really badly. And I think it would be a joy for Australians to learn the culture from older people, the traditional owners of their particular lands. I think Australians would get a lot out of it. I've been trying to direct people to the right communities. They're all around the place. Every state, every corner of Australia, there are communities who want to tell you their story. Not because they want to entertain you necessarily, but they want you to care. That's what Aboriginal people have been asking for 230 years. Ever since, Cook and company arrived, Aboriginal people have been trying to incorporate British people into the system of law. And that has been misunderstood, sometimes for venal reasons, other times through ignorance. But the offer still stands, Australia. A vast majority of Aboriginal people want you to honour the earth, because that's our responsibility too. And if you don't, we can't. So thinking about these things and thinking about food, I'm afraid, has to be political. We're not just talking about a science, an agricultural science. We're talking about a whole history of human development on the earth. And we just can't pretend that all we're talking about is chemistry in the ground. It's far more than that. She's a dynamic woman, and we need to understand how she works, what she wants. And the great demonstration of the Earth's power is after the fires here in 2019, 2020. I was wandering around feeling sorry for myself, lost the crop, nearly lost the house, lost all the fences. And I was thinking, we put all the work into that crop of kangaroo grass and all burnt now. And within a fortnight, it started to come back. We had one good rain, all the carbon stretched out across the land, combined with the water, bingo. We had a crop of the grass we'd hardly ever noticed before. Microlenus dipoides, Mamanja Knobloch. And it came back, it was just so beautiful. And within 3 weeks, it looked like the farm hadn't been burnt at all. It was so green. And that told us a huge lesson. And so we raced around then, finding different seedlings that are sprouting up. We've got little trees here now, 8 foot, 10 foot high, that we pricked out of the soil after the fires. And the other thing we noticed within the forest, that now that the canopy was gone, because the fire just obliterated most of the forest canopy here, our grasses were growing underneath the trees. We'd never seen it before. We'd never seen the canopy so bare before. But the sunlight reaching the forest floor started to grow the grasses. So now we know that the program we'd started about thinning the forest so that there are fewer but bigger trees, and under those grow the tubers and grasses. That's what we noticed after the fire. We have to maintain that. We have to find a way of harvesting within the forest. People say, oh, you'll never get a tractor through there, you'll never get a harvester through there. Well, We can send tourists to the moon. So I reckon we can build a harvester to move in amongst trees. I don't think it's beyond us. We've just got to want to do it. And I think we'll do it when we want to reward the earth for her persistence and reward her with our love and respect, not our disdain. We don't tell the earth what to do. She provides for us, but she doesn't get told. At the moment, we're trying to tell the earth what she will grow. And that's not the way around it at all. We're here at the behest of the earth, not the other way around. Two major religions in the world say that man shall have dominion over the earth, and they mean man. But really, we are here to serve the earth. We are here to conserve the earth. And we can eat well, as the old people did. They were 6'2" tall, perfect teeth, lived to a long age, perfect digestion, lean as whippets. You know, those people were in fine fettle. There's no problem with our food and with our ability to live well here. It's a matter of making sure that our great-grandchildren can do it. At the moment, we are behaving as if we despise our great-grandchildren. And I've got grandchildren, and I do not despise them, and I refuse to leave a world for their children that is unlivable. I think we can avoid it. I think it's just incredibly irresponsible, incredibly selfish to refuse to consider what our great-grandchildren might wake up to. Bruce.
Thank you, Uncle Bruce, for your talk, sharing the story of recovery after the fires and reminding us that we are here in service to Mother Earth. For she is generous with her abundance. It is our responsibility to ensure our future ancestors can also experience her gifts and that no one gets left behind. If you've just joined us, my name is Jen Ray, and you're watching Melbourne Conversations, Aboriginal Food Systems, a part of Melbourne Conversation series run by the City of Melbourne on the third Wednesday of every month. You can submit your questions throughout the event, and we'll answer some of them at the end. Submit your questions by going to the Slido and entering hashtag Aboriginal Foods, or you can use the QR code or link that is now on your screens. You can also subscribe to Melbourne Knowledge Week's YouTube channel to stay up to date with Melbourne Conversation events. Now let's get started by welcoming Tracy Hardy and Joshua Gilbert. To settle into this conversation, we'll start with an introduction by each of our wonderful panelists and ask if they might also share a story about a specific Indigenous food or Aboriginal agricultural practice that is meaningful to them and why. Tracy, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks so much for the introduction. Hi, everybody. My name is Tracy. I'm a Gamilaroi descendant of matrilineal line of descent. So my ancestors were from between what is now known as Coliandabri and Mungandai on the Barwon River. I was born and raised on Coomera country in southwest Queensland, and I've been very fortunate to call Gubbi Gubbi Kabi Kabi country home now on Queensland's Sunshine Coast for the last 15 years, I think it is now. Before I start to have a chat today too, I also like to extend my respect and acknowledge our ancestors, traditional owners and custodians and future elders and past, present and emerging elders as well, for all their knowledge that they've been able to maintain and protect, and so that we can enjoy that today. I'm sitting in my beautiful therapeutic yarning space at the moment. Behind me I have two beautiful prints by a Bundjalung artist called Brad Turner, and I'm wearing a black top with a beautiful print by a business called Kunjala Arts, and it's got Be Kind on it. So I think this is relevant for today because we've got to be kind to our Mother Earth, as Uncle Bruce has mentioned. And I think I've got dark blonde hair, and I'm wearing two emu feather earrings in my ears. But is that all I need to do? I've got lost track now what I'm up to. I'll let you guide me.
Lovely. I was wondering if there was a specific, Aboriginal food or an original agricultural practice that carries meaning for you that you might like to share.
Oh gosh, I'd take up the whole session if I talked about that. It's really hard to just choose one and the practices, it's so hard to just choose one because it's kind of all together. They're amazing. And I think if I had to choose one, I think I would go with wattle seed. So I'm founder of the business Wattle Seed Nutrition, Health and Wellbeing. And the reason why my business is called Wattle Seed is because I grew up on my non-Indigenous grandfather's small farm just outside of town, and it was absolutely covered in Gundabluey wattle, and that's my homage to home because that's where I spent a lot of my childhood and youth as well. So wattle seed would have to be one of my favorites, and also because of its versatility and nutrient profile, it's just amazing and incredible, as is all of our foods as well. But our food practices, I think I really love the interconnectedness that happens with the way our ancestral, traditional, and even modern day food practices with those traditional foods is really powerful, and I really enjoy the spiritual connection with it and that cultural fulfillment that it brings as well.
Great, thank you. And we're going to delve into some of that in a little bit here. Thanks, Tracy. Joshua.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Jan. Hi, everyone. I'm a Warramai man from the mid-north coast of New South Wales, and would like to start by acknowledging country here. I'm on Warramai country. This is where my mob's from and where my family's connections go through the mountains around where I live today, in a place that's now known as Gloucester, that was settled, colonised in the early 1800s. 1825 is my family's first clash with white farmers in the area here. So it's a continuing condition and story, I think, that still happens here on country today and on country right across Australia. I am wearing a black pair of glasses, have blue eyes and brownie coloured hair. I'm wearing a blue, red, and white jumper that's striped, and in the background is some of our farming coats and a window to the outside. For me, I think if I reflect on the practice that I marvel the most, I think is really our mob's adaptability and honour of cultural practices and intertwining that with Western agriculture. I think it's particularly interesting how our mob, we're faced with colonisation, and often at times we had colonisation through cattle and sheep on country, and different mobs as well prior to white colonisers rocking up on the doorstep. So often at times I don't think we think about the sequencing of that, but what strikes me most during those times is our mob's ability to see the impacts of colonisation and adapt to that, with many mobs staying on farms, using Indigenous knowledge to help guide Western agricultural practices as well, and combining those for a new meaning and a new identity on land. As I said, my family's connections go back to that from about 1825, and through my dad's family we know that some of his family members married bushrangers and were able to live off the land and escape police, while also being able to listen to cattle and horses roaming in the fields nearby and understanding where police are. So for me, it's all around adaptability and that transformation that we undertook as mob to work and clash, I guess, as well, but work with colonisers to kind of create this new version of Australia, while also having our integrity and our identity transforming through that period of time.
Thank you, Josh. Both of you have spoken quite a bit about interconnectedness of practices and so forth. And I'm wondering if, for people who might not know the term Aboriginal agriculture, if maybe you could expand on that, Joshua, and tell us, what it means to you, and if there's a more formal definition.
Yeah, so I mean, there isn't a specific definition. I think what at times we do in Australia, particularly, is try and compare an Indigenous agricultural system or an Indigenous way of lifestyle prior to colonization and try and compare that to a white system or the more dominant system that we see in Australia today. It's always comparing back rather than using our mobs' practices and values as the kind of benchmark and then comparing to Western agriculture. We always seem to be trying to fit a definition of what white society defined as agriculture, and we're trying to fit pieces of Indigenous practices to that to try and find relevance. For me, I really struggle with that because I think it doesn't matter if we were the first farmers or whether our systems are alike that of Western agriculture. What we know is our mob are on the ground and survived for tens of thousands of years. We lived in a system that worked. We were able to sustain life. We were able to feed our mob. We had practices and cultural practices that were so integral to our way of life that really guided the way in which we worked and managed the land. And once colonization hit, we actually underwent a whole series of change. And for me, it's around our practices transforming through that our definition of agriculture today doesn't actually acknowledge that Indigenous people and farmers were there guiding, early colonizers as to where the best water should be coming from or where good grass was for their cattle. All of that actually happened, and we don't acknowledge that broader representation of Indigenous people within agriculture. And that for me is a huge risk that we basically get stuck in this comparison stage where we say Indigenous people farmed pre-colonization, we have agriculture post-colonization, and there's no real marrying of the two or understanding that they both come into this broader definition of agriculture today.
Yeah, I think I've heard you say, that there's a problem around the romanticization of Aboriginal culture, and that doesn't bring us into contemporary times. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, and I think it might also go a bit broader that we romanticize early settler life as well. I mean, the man from Snowy River as a classic example of what Western agriculture once was. It still fascinates me that there's that romanticization, but equally that's portrayed through what Indigenous culture is. And what we do is take this in my opinion, take this very fixed view of what Indigenous culture and therefore agriculture is. That Indigenous people farmed, native foods or bush foods or foods from Australia, and that our culture kind of started and stopped with that. That there was this period of culture, and it couldn't adapt, it couldn't emerge. So some of the early anthropological works done by Stanner, for instance, start talking about Aboriginal people feeling like they're losing their sense of identity and culture through food systems and through agriculture because they're no longer relevant to the ancient practices that were done. And for me, it's if you take that adaptability sense, you take away that romanticism of culture being, mobs still being able to practice culture on their own land freely. If you take that romanticism away and appreciate that communities have changed, our mob adapted perfectly in a lot of ways to this very transforming society. We don't have access to land like we once had. We have a huge population shift in Australia as well, and we're now impacted by climate change yet again. All of those factors mean that we can't romanticize our systems. We need to think this in a real sense.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. I'm wanting to ask Tracy here. Tracy, you were saying something about there's something like 65,000 different types of Aboriginal food items, right? And not much is known about a lot of them. Australia is the only continent in the world that doesn't eat from the seeds that are indigenous to the soil or the foods that are produced as a result of that. I'm wondering, what do you see as some of the implications of this from a health perspective, and potentially how can you see it changing?
Yeah, just it's actually 6,500. I
Oh,
wish
so
it was
did I say 65,000?
No, you just added another zero on there. That's totally fine.
There we go.
So
There's my
to
math
my
skills
knowledge,
for you. Everyone knows it. Sorry.
Wouldn't it be amazing if we'd had that? So to my knowledge, there's 6,500 traditional bush foods that are, edible in Australia. Only about 20 of those are commercialised. So what I sort of think why I have an interest in this space, because, I'm a nutritionist, dietitian, and why I have an interest in this space is I think about our agricultural system and our food system, and the fact that it's, predicted that it's not going to be sustainable to feed us by 2050, the way it's going at the moment. And when I think about those, and that means, sorry, I'm jumping around here, this is the way my mind thinks. So food security, we know, is a big issue within many of our remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander areas, regions, but it's also something that's experienced in urban spaces as well. So this is something that's known. So if we can sort of, as Josh mentioned there before, there's not ready access to a lot of these traditional foods and food systems, whereas there's an untapped potential there as well. So we've got 20 that are commercialised, right? But there's still all the rest there that we can access and utilise and draw upon, and that is being utilised and drawn upon, and can actually be utilised and drawn upon to address that food security issue. What I'm interested in as well, and something that I found quite interesting when I was doing my PhD, when I was looking at the food security literature, a lot of the ways that they looked at addressing food security within both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and non-Indigenous spaces was that they were looking at that commercialised market-based foods that is drawn from that very linear food system. They weren't really looking at or even considering those traditional bush foods or how they can actually be utilised to address that food security issue. So when I think about that, and I think about the rates of food insecurity and the fourth world that's been experienced by many of our small and discrete and remote communities, but also the real risk that food security is going to be experienced by everybody by 2050. Those who are already now food insecure are going to experience it even worse by then. This is not just, as Bruce has mentioned before, Uncle Bruce, who's talking about this is something that can benefit everybody. If we can tap into and respect those traditional ecological knowledges and value those as well, those foods and the way those food systems and the practices that go around that have got, to me, an enormous potential to be able to address food security for both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, but also non-Indigenous peoples living in Australia, because it not only provides a very nutritious food source, it also addresses, from an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander perspective, it addresses cultural determinants and some social determinants as well. But when you look at it, it actually also helps to revitalise and revegetate and recare for our Mother Earth here as well. Those knowledges are being recognised internationally and globally as being the solution to this crisis that we're facing at the moment. And it's got enormous untapped potential there. But I think in saying that, though, I also acknowledge that it's incredibly important to protect those knowledges that go with that, because at the moment we're seeing a lot of exploitation and theft of those knowledges and lack of benefit sharing going back to the people whose knowledges that other non-Indigenous businesses are profiting from.
Tracy, yes, thank you for opening this all up, and I can see Joshua, shaking his head. This is just making me think about, the language around superfoods, the exoticization of First Nations food in Aboriginal food in Australia. Joshua, you wrote the commercialization strategy for the Kakadu plum. I'm wondering if your expertise in this area, if you can illuminate some of the tensions that exist in this space.
Yeah, and I think for me, certainly I was part of a team that wrote that, and for me, the key learnings, I guess, are the importance of cultural narratives to be told through our foods, and that retention of knowledge and respect, I guess, that surrounds Indigenous foods. For me, I look at the agricultural system, I guess, in Australia, and the literature from overseas provides a good example as to where we are in this kind of conversation or at some stages debate here in Australia. We're about 40 years behind that, behind the US and Canada in these conversations, and for me, that's a huge, stark concern that we haven't really had these discussions broader than whether what the definition of agriculture is, and starting to look at some of these bush foods or native foods and understand what they mean here in Australia. It's a concern, I think, for society because, as Tracy said, we know these foods are going to be pertinent to making sure our mob have access to food, and we know that Indigenous people, through current ownership structures, which aren't perfect in any way, as Uncle Bruce alluded to, but Indigenous people still have 40% of Australia's land mass. We know that climate change is going to mean that the country that we have is going to be pertinent to feeding our population going forward. And when we actually look at the bush food space, we know that only 1% or maybe 2% of the benefits that are being produced from that space is actually going back into Indigenous hands. We know that mob, having this struggle in remote communities as to whether they should sell the product on one hand or whether they should use it for their intended use back in the community, for being able to use that to heal and to have cultural business. So for me, all of these factors are kind of coming into play. We've seen the commercialization of macadamia nut as a success story of commercialization gone wrong in many ways, and what the demands for these products are, and we know that there's a lot of interest in them, often by non-Indigenous people. And for me as an Indigenous farmer, quite often we fall back into this dialogue that Indigenous people, this is the romanticism coming out, Indigenous people should only farm bush foods, that we should just be farming native foods, without appreciating that we're also farming beef cattle and cropping and all these other things as well. For me, that risk means that we don't actually acknowledge Indigenous farmers more broadly. We don't understand and have the ability to set our own research agendas and commercialize products that we want to commercialize. Actually, what happens in this space is a white researcher comes out and says, "Oh, hey, we've got this idea about this product that you have. Can we use that to commercialize?" And they set the research agenda and start these conversations around what that looks like. Where mob don't get to self-determine the practices or commercialize foods that we want to commercialize in the way that they're done, that's important and provides benefit back to mob. So for me, that's kind of the overarching sense of where it's all at in a few quick minutes.
Yeah, I mean, there has been. Oh, sorry. Yeah, absolutely.
Say to that, I just have to add to that. I totally agree with that, Josh. And something that when you're talking about the who is leading the driving this, the non-Indigenous researchers, people in the food space, but it's actually driven from that. It doesn't factor in. It's driven from an industrialized food system lens. They want it to be that linear lens, and it completely takes out that cyclical, reciprocal nature and relationship we have with it, and the stories and the practices that go between it as well. I know that there's been push and stories being shared by other non-Indigenous people who are leading, I should say, or profiting most in that space, who are driving. So we need to commercialize it, but taking it off from the land and marketing it, and it's taking away all those stories and connections that go with those foods as well. So I just thought I'd add in that as well. I think that's something we need to be mindful about. Having that balance, absolutely. It's complex.
I mean, there is an industry oversaturation right now, where we've got branded sort of Indigenous products that are appearing on the shelves and so forth, but many of them are not owned or ran by First Nations people. And we did have a question come up from the panel that's asking about what is being termed as blackwashing, where it doesn't deliver benefits back to Indigenous communities. And I'm wondering if there's any recommendations that you might have to counteract this.
May I make a suggestion? I think, and it's something that there is some work being done in this space. There's been examples of this being driven over in the WA area by NAKPA, NAAKPE, the Noongar. Is that right, Josh? I'll find out and I'll refer to it. But basically having, yeah, so it's basically a way and a strategy of mapping the supply chain and having transparency. So I think if someone, obviously there are many people who are wanting, non-Indigenous people within that supply chain who are wanting to do better, but if they are, a really good step within that process would be to be transparent within that supply chain, because I know that I've looked at research when it was for one example, it was a bush tomato, and that went through the supply chain there. And when people are promoting, saying, oh yes, we're giving back to community, we're helping them self-determine their economic impacts in community by sourcing our food from them, the actual dollar value per kilo of what's actually going back into that community, as opposed to what the dollar value that is going here at the end, is vastly different. And that is not being transparent. And they're using this giving back to community as a marketing ploy and a marketing tool. And that's not transparent. So I really think that this tool, I'm going to bring it up and I'll talk about it later. I was actually pulling it up. I've got so many screens open at the moment. This tool that's up at the moment that they're doing is a way of being able to map that, and I think that's really valuable and really important, and will assist both consumers, because they've got the purchase power, and also those within the supply chain in order to be able to step up and be transparent and be able to give back.
Yeah, that would be wonderful if you could share that with this group, because that's a tool that we need. Josh, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, I'll tell you my grand plan, I guess, and it's not perfect. It's informed by some research that I've been conducting, but for me, I think there is a concern that a lot of so bush foods are a supply limited market. We know we have both Indigenous and non-Indigenous suppliers of bush foods in Australia. The concern is around that there's no identification of products that are either grown by Indigenous people or non-Indigenous people. So there's no classification system that says that a product is either Indigenous picked or harvested or grown in a commercial sense compared to that's not. We also know that there's non-Indigenous people who also own plant breeders' rights over some of the Indigenous products and bush foods that are out there. So for me, the kind of grand plan is that if we were able to have a system similar to the US that trademarked some of the actual products and certify them as being Indigenous grown or Indigenous produced, then that's a first step to recognise that Indigenous people are actually involved in that process. And the next step on top of that is actually providing Indigenous producers with a premium price for their product. And I often give the example of the carbon market for this. So if a major airline wants to buy carbon credits for those that, who are using their flights, obviously not so much at the moment, but pre-COVID, if you have two suppliers of carbon credits, an Indigenous producer or person who's doing fire stick burning, and another person who's doing growing trees. Both are great for the environment. Both are sequestering carbon. You can buy the credit, but I can tell you every time that when a company wants to do and showcase the credits that they're buying from a person, they're not showing the success story of some of these trees growing. They're actually going out to mob and saying, "Oh, hey, can we film some of your fire stick burning and the cultural knowledge that you're using there?" For me, there has to be a premium price on that product. And it's the same for food. There's all this cultural knowledge that goes into the food system, the production of that, the stories that our mob hold. All of that goes into the product, and therefore that should be rewarded at a premium price that goes back to mob. The only way of making sure that happens is by getting a trademark system to then provide that back, because we know that there has been kind of like cladding within the broader procurement market, and we need to make sure that we have some kind of level of protection for mob who are actually doing it properly, and that they're protected to get the price and premium price back. So that's how I do it.
I love that you jumped in with your master plan. That's excellent. We're jumping into some questions here. I have a whole list of questions. I could probably keep you online for another couple of hours here, but I'm going to jump into this one here. The question is, I've heard that traditional foods are most nutritious or healing when grown naturally, and they are harder to grow at the same scale as contemporary Western agriculture. What are the risks of overharvesting indigenous foods, and are there systems that could allow for us to grow the seeds indigenous to our soil at the scale that could feed our population? Great question.
Yeah, they're right. Obviously, we know that wild harvested food has a higher nutrition profile. Josh, what do you think? What would you say to that, and from an agricultural perspective?
So yeah, I mean the other factor around wild harvest is that like when you go out to the bush to wild harvest products, each of them actually have different profiles. So for Kakadu plum, for instance, which is known to have the highest amount of vitamin C of any natural product in the world, it might vary from one tree, and the tree next to it might have next to no vitamin C. So because that commercialization and the plant breeding hasn't happened, it's hard to get a good indication as to whether, if you grew it in a Western agricultural sense and went through a whole plant breeding process, whether that would kind of still occur, or whether you would be able to produce plants that just had the highest amount of vitamin C. The cultural issue and kind of the bigger question I think we need to ask is, do we want our bush foods or our native foods to Australia to go down that process? And, do we want to go down that GMO angle, or do we want to have our bush foods turn into products that are Roundup resistant, so that we can, grow Uncle Bruce's kangaroo grass on scale and spray it with chemical? They're the kind of questions that we need to kind of have the conversations about, and we're not having those conversations in Australia yet. So I think for me there is a great opportunity for us to look at the bush food space and kind of set up a set of definitions and a process in which we want it to be commercialized, rather than just kind of leaving it to the general market and saying, let us know what you think, or go and do whatever you want and let us know what you've done later. And the only way of having that conversation is by us setting the research agendas and allowing mob to have the hands in the dirt, the keys and all the tools to be able to have the conversations as to where we want to guide this. If mob want to just wild harvest products, then that should be fine, and we should be paying people a premium for that, rather than penalising them because that's how they want it to be grown.
I think I agree that, and it's something that I always say at the moment, and you touched on it too, Josh, is that at the moment there is a vast imbalance in representation within the bush food sector, where Josh touched on it before. It's less than 2%. Some the reports are varied at the moment, but it's, despite whether they update it, there's still massive big imbalance with representation. And I think we need to change that. And I think before these decisions are made, and who's driving those decisions need to be driven by First Nations peoples of Australia, and ask those questions, not forced upon.
So for people who are interested in supporting and engaging, what do you think are some of the ways? What are the steps that they can take to learn more, to properly support, to not get brainwashed or or pointed in the wrong directions?
For me personally, my personal opinion is to connect respectfully and with cultural humility, and also before doing that, reflect upon and acknowledge and work through your own worldviews, potential biases that you might have, and how they may influence that interaction with cultural humility, because it's very well, you might be well-meaning, however, you're still imposing your ideals sometimes. So I think sitting and listening, deep listening would be a good step in that space. And, you know, being okay and not having fear. I think for at the moment, I get this sense, I was born in the time when native title first came out, and I still remember back then, I grew up in a very white pastoralist town, the fear and the misinformation that was getting transferred around within the, you know, pastoral and agricultural space, that everyone's land was going to be taken because native title is going to be happening. And I get a sense that there's a little bit of fear perhaps happening within the bush food sector with those non-Indigenous growers. And it's not a space of necessarily having to have fear. It's sitting back and actually sitting in a position of working with as opposed to competing with, you know what I mean? So I think that would be my contribution to that question.
Yeah. Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately there isn't a lot of literature in this space in Australia. There's a lot overseas and a lot of different kind of examples as to where I think we could head in Australia, hopefully in the next 10 years to try and catch up that 40 plus year gap. But obviously some of the first places to start are just having a look at what resources you can find online. So, you know, have a look at Tracy's website and see all the great stuff that she's doing. Have a look at Uncle Bruce's book and the work that they're doing down at Black Duck Farm. It's quite incredible. And, you know, I think probably Uncle Bruce has a speaking event every day, let alone multiple every day. And there's some great opportunities to really have a look at some of the conversations that are happening there. And it's through kind of connecting with people and sharing with some of the mob around here, you know, and engaging in that conversation that you'll start learning. There is very limited resources, unfortunately, but really it's around upskilling mobs so that we can create more resources to keep having the conversations, to, you know, write books and be involved in TV and things like that. That's where I think we need to head into the future.
I might add too, other tools that can exist is also things like the Nagoya Protocol, you know, and helping that can sort of perhaps assist with putting frameworks in place and, you know, how to support sharing the benefits of that commercialization of those traditional ecological knowledges that are embedded in those genetic resources. Terri Janke, she's written some information, like lots of literature and resources and tools on Indigenous cultural and intellectual property, and she's got some resources within there as well. And there's lots of amazing emerging Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander researchers now working in this space, which is incredible. So keep an eye out on what's happening. Look at Uncle Bruce's farm, Black Duck Farm. There's research going on that space. Lots happening at other universities. Just keep your eye out as well, and really, really sit there and embrace these resources and knowledges that are being shared, because they're gifts that are being given.
Yeah, and also adding to that list, I would say Zena Kumston's publication that she put out was a very generous publication, you know, and it's available online. It's not asking for a currency, but to acknowledge the, you know, the cultural knowledge that is in that document, and not to profit from it. So like, and I think some of these we can make sure that we have available to our listeners today. We are running out of time. I'm so sad. I have a question here, and this is about imagining. So the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, have recently released their latest report, and it's the most dire to date, with the United Nations chief calling it a code red for humanity, with scientists warning that the world must act fast to avoid climate catastrophe if we surpass that 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2040. And we know that the IPCC is conservative, so we're more likely looking at around 2034. We know that Australia's food system is highly vulnerable and more frequent to intense weather events driven by climate change. We're already witnessing the variability of crop yields, rising food prices, and drought impacts on already fragile ecosystems and communities. So while a low-carbon economy is critical to halting this doomsday trajectory, our food system plays a vital role. So Josh and Tracy, last question for you today. If we were to cast ourselves into the future, say 2035, and imagine what a transformative food system looks like, informed by Aboriginal agricultural food system practices, ideas, and people, what are the steps that need to happen today to make this happen?
I'll let you start, Josh.
Yeah, no worries. So for me, we have very limited, if any, understanding as to what representation of Indigenous farmers are in the Australian population. We know roughly 3%, but that's only based on ABS data, which isn't fantastic. And that mob don't get asked to identify as Indigenous through any of the agricultural research and development corporations that exist in Australia. So for me, the kind of the steps that need to happen are we need to identify Indigenous farmers out there and what they're producing, their size and scale. We need to lobby the research and development corporations for all Indigenous paid levies to them to go into an Indigenous research and development corporation, which would then fund Indigenous-led research. And we know that Indigenous research will be more understanding and more applicable to climate change, and that will help develop the food system because we're defining the agenda to move forward in that space. The only thing I'd add, I know we're running out of time, but just quickly, by 2035, it'll only be 20 years since agriculture in Australia really recognised that farmers were actually on the front lines of climate change, which is really scary for me. It was only 2016 that I led a group of farmers to say that we believe in climate change and it was impacting our farms, and that only received national kind of approval in early 2017. It's not that long ago, so we need to recognise that that's all happening. We need to speed up the process and really understand that farmers are doing both good things and bad things, and we need to start working on that very quickly.
Yeah, that's true. Bringing that forward, that it is farmers that are on the front line and who has their back. Yeah. Tracy.
Oh gosh, I was getting it, but I could be here all day. I think that I would like to see research done with and led by traditional knowledge holders, and also respect being given to those knowledge holders and those food practices as well. I think that I'd like there to be action taken within, for me, a big one would be to have action taken for more transparency within the bush food supply chain, and also how we can identify and provide support to those within the Indigenous agricultural sector as well as the bush food supply chain, with how they can support their agency to be able to lead within that space.
Wow. Josh and Tracy, this has been a great conversation. I hope it's one that continues. And to all the listeners out there, please check out Josh's website and as well as Tracy's. We'll make sure that they're in the comments so that you can have the links to that. And to everyone who's joined us today, thank you for coming in and being here for this Melbourne Conversation event. The City of Melbourne runs these events on the third Wednesday of every month. And thanks again to our partners at the Sandra DeMeo Foundation for co-hosting this conversation. The next conversation will be about the digital literacy gap, talking to researchers, social workers, and technical experts on the state of the digital divide in our city and how we can create equitable access to digital technologies. You can see the details of these future events by simply searching Melbourne Conversations on the City of Melbourne's website. Don't forget to subscribe to this Melbourne Knowledge Week's YouTube channel and to stay up to date with Melbourne Conversation events. There's also a link in the YouTube chat to a survey. The City of Melbourne's team would love to hear your thoughts on this event. Thank you again for joining us, and goodbye.